Curt's Autobiography by Curt Slabaugh. This book is dedicated to my family and to all those who have helped me to form my values and given me life. Acknowledgements. Ralph G. McFadden is my oldest friend. I met him in church camp before I was in high school and was impressed with his friendly and gregarious nature. He lived in Elgin, Illinois at that time when I was living near Rockford, Illinois, so we attended different schools and churches. Other than camp and occasional larger church meetings, we met again at Manchester College in the fall of 1951, where we became classmates. We talked about becoming roommates there after our sophomore years, but that did not happen because I married Marcy that summer. We saw little of each other our last 2 years at Manchester because I was living off campus. He spent much of his time with his future wife, Barbara, and we had no classes together. Then we had little contact for over 60 years, except for 2 or 3 college reunions. In early 2016, working on this autobiography, I called Ralph to help me recall details of our early friendship. He offered to help me get this published, and he and his partner, Keo, visited us here at Black River Harbor that summer. Ralph gave me 3 of his books to read: his autobiography, his biography of Keo, and his book, For Life is a Journey, where he confronts the church's blindness to the damaging injustice of homophobia. My first exposure of homophobia that I can remember was in high school, when some of my peers would joke about fags or queers. In college and during my first marriage, those epitaphs I often continued to hear, but never knew well a homosexual person until I met partners Mary Nelson and Sharon Doom here at Black River Harbor. They initially were renting Betsy's mother's cabin down the road, and later had the house next door to us built to live in. A vivid experience I had was when Sharon and I were riding our small motorcycles on the dirt road south of our home. She hit soft sand and fell, badly hurting her leg. I rode back and got Mary. When the two met at this unfortunate time, I was struck by the love that was evident. I asked myself, why should anyone condemn such loving relationships? Ralph's intimate knowledge of this societal problem, his excellent books, and his great help to me with editing, publishing, and meaningful friendship is hereby acknowledged. My oldest friend in years, Roy Vandersheer, a former high school teacher, elementary principal, and superintendent, has been most appreciated by me for his knowledge of educational principles, great sense of humor, and practice of good common sense. I envied his superior tennis skills. My next oldest friend in years, Curt Schoening, introduced me to canoeing, which led to many years of joy and adventure. His influence also made me a birder, an activity that I enjoy to this day. His social and political ideas have impressed me. Darwin and Ellie Wilcox are the couple that has been our oldest friends. We made many trips with them to ski in Colorado or vacation in Florida, and had many visits to each other's homes. We partied with them more than anyone else. It seems that everyone who has met him appreciates Darwin's droll sense of humor. Our friends Bob and Jerry personify what wonderful things can happen when a principal befriends the parents of his students. Not only did we become best friends, but our children formed lifelong friendships. And on May 13th, 2017, Bob gave away my daughter Judy at her wedding in Denver. After being with Betsy, I have enjoyed and appreciated her brothers Roy and Dewey. Before his death in 2006, I especially enjoyed associating with her youngest brother John. After retiring and starting to spend most of my time up north, I met some interesting people who became good friends. Monica Mears, Dave and Karen Evans, Peggy Cron, John Hellman, Ron and Denise Flory, Tom and Mary Schroller, Bob and Sue Landis, Jerry and Connie Greeny, Cher Jordan, Norman Bishop, Nancy Ramsey, and Randy Negri have all been enjoyable people to know. When Betsy and I first started living here together full-time, we were fortunate to get Dr. James Rocco for our family physician, and his wife Kathy, and our local pharmacist. My brother Paul has had more influence on my life than all of my 4 other brothers combined. His help in my young adulthood certainly helped me achieve economic success, and his generosity led to great adventures and enjoyable times. My first wife, Marcy, has been very helpful to me as I tried to recall events as long as 65 years ago. She was a good wife and mother. I can't quite forgive myself for my lack of commitment in our marriage, but she has forgiven me, and I appreciate it. My wife of nearly 47 years, Betsy, has put up with my often moody, cantankerous behavior. Her cheerful tolerance, friendly behavior with others, generosity, and thoughtfulness have been a boon to my life. Preface. Curt, in writing his autobiography, has called into focus in-depth review of his 84 years, even going back to the beginning as a child. Not many of us have such an ability to recall those very early years. In the process of remembering, he has not hesitated, with courage and insight, to be very personal, and even choosing at times to be confessional. His life, as he takes us back over the years, has had and included some remarkable and exceptional times of pain and also joy. He is not reluctant to let us in on the times that he may have hurt someone or brought happiness to the lives of others. He is not writing to educate us. Rather, if we do learn something about living as we enter into his life, it is that which makes his writing so helpful and worthy. His own life has been one of experiencing the fullness of living, and that becomes, for most of us, an encouragement to not only to review our own lifespan, but perhaps wonder if we still have time yet to experience and carry out what is still in our own bucket list. Curt, with his writing, has called upon courage, valor, and a certain amount of audacity to lay out his life and experience. He has, from my perspective, with insight and discernment, tackled some of the deeper issues of living. He has shared those with us cheerfully and articulately. I am grateful for his willingness to let us in on the meaning of living. Thank you, Curt, for your openness, frankness, and honesty. I thank you for the blessing that you have brought to our friendship. Ralph G. McFadden. Prologue. I finally started to write this on November 8, 2007, after years of procrastination. My motivation for writing this started after I retired in June 1988, when I visited Aunt Ida and Uncle Ralph Lehman in Lakeland, Florida. Aunt Ida, my mother's older sister, was writing her autobiography, but needed it typed and printed. I am a good typist and volunteered to do so, and over the next few months I finished it. Her writings were so interesting to me and to most other members of my family that I resolved to write my own someday. Later, I typed my dad's autobiography for him, and that one, too, was of great interest to most of us who knew him. In the last few years, I have been motivated further by reading The Ancestor's Tale by Richard Dawkins, one of the most interesting books ever for me. He wrote, "Written records are more reliable than oral tradition by a discerning margin. You might think that each generation of children, knowing their parents as well as most children do, would listen to their detailed reminiscences and relay them to the next generation. 5 generations on, a voluminous oral tradition should, one might think, have survived. I remember my 4 grandparents clearly, but of my 8 great-grandparents, I know a handful of fragmentary anecdotes. One great-grandfather habitually sang a certain nonsense rhyme, which I can sing, but only while lacing his boots. Another was greedy for cream and would knock the cheeseboard over when losing. A third was a country doctor. That is about my limit. How have 8 entire lives been so reduced? How, when the chain of informants connecting us back to the eyewitness seems so short, and human conversation so rich, could all those thousands of personal details that made up the lifetimes of 8 human individuals be so fast forgotten? Richard Dawkins knows much more about his 8 great-grandparents than I do mine. I don't recall being told anything about them. My memories of my 4 grandparents include many incidents, and I was especially fond of my mother's parents. Her dad, George Willie Bowman, wrote a 12-page autobiography that is of great interest to my brothers and me. Because he wrote it, we know more about his early life than any of the other grands, and I learned a little about his parents from the autobiography. Her mother, Miranda Brubaker Bowman, lived with us for several years on the farm in Illinois, and she was a delightful person. I am a Civil War buff, and have read much about that horrible conflict. Mary Chestnut, the wife of a Confederate cabinet officer and a personal friend of Jefferson Davis and his family, kept a journal for all the years of the war and some of the years before and after. Her life was impressive to me. I am not hoping to become famous as she is to historians, but I want my life to be of interest to others, especially those who have known me. Childhood and adolescence. I was born on June 5th, 1933, at Bethany Hospital in Chicago, where my mother's brother, Dr. Curtis Bowman, was the attending physician. My parents wanted a girl and had only girls' names picked out, so Curtis was chosen for me, but Curtis seemed too adult-sounding for a little boy. So I was called Buddy for many years. We were living in Flora, Indiana at the time. Flora is about 140 miles southeast from my birthplace in Chicago. I have 2 memories of Flora. One was of a barn burning down, and the other was of a flight in an airport with my brother Jim, Dad, and the pilot. It was the beginning of a lifelong love of flying for me. My dad, in his autobiography, wrote that they lived there in 6 different houses. But I probably was only in the last 4, and the only thing I remember about one of them was one back door screen where we could see the barn burning. In August of 1937, we moved to Liberty, Indiana. For 5 years, we lived in a white bungalow at 103 North Fairground Street in Liberty, close to the doctor, dentist, and post office. In the other direction were the fairgrounds and water treatment plant. I remember playing there in the big storm sewer pipes, sometimes going deep through one to the first bend where it became pitch dark. I also remember riding my bike down to a stone highway bridge that crossed a ravine. Down below on the rocks we would see snakes sunning themselves. To me, it was a nice place to live. There was no kindergarten offered at that time in Liberty. The only thing I remember about first grade was after I had walked home one day for lunch, I stopped to play in a sandbox with a preschooler friend instead of going immediately back to school. Not much later, I went back home to my mother's surprise. She made me take a bath and sent me back to school. I walked in, saw the teacher in front of the classroom, saw almost all of the other first graders turn to look at me, and I had to answer her question. "Curtis, why are you so late?" I told her my mother made me take a bath. The image I remember of that teacher was her ankle-length dress and gray hair. I cannot remember her face. My second grade teacher was a pretty young woman with long dark hair who took us on several field trips. I don't remember my third grade teacher in Liberty at all. I do vaguely remember going to church in a big white frame building out in the country, but I remember nothing of the people there. I know we occasionally had a picnic after church at a place which had a creek running through it. During the summer times, while living in northern Indiana, we would vacation in Onekama, Michigan, where my maternal grandparents lived and my paternal grandparents had a cabin they regularly rented. It was a grand place for me. My cousins Bob and Ken Kinsey and Sally Lehman often were there at the same time, and I idolized them. They seemed quite tolerant of the noisy little kid I probably was then. I learned to swim and fish there, and especially enjoyed the sand beach on Lake Michigan. The sand there had a quality that caused it to make a strange noise as you walked on it. In the summer of 1942, my dad got a job teaching in Lockport, Illinois, some 40 miles south of where my grandparents lived in Chicago, and we moved from Indiana to Illinois. This was during the World War II housing shortage. The superintendent at Lockport had promised Dad housing in Lockport, but did not follow through, so I and my 3 younger brothers had to live with my maternal grandparents, and my older brother Jim lived with my paternal grandparents. I suspect my parents divided their time with both sets. Some of my 3rd grade was in Delano School in Chicago, while I was living with my maternal grandparents. I don't remember my teachers at all there, but I do remember roller skating in Gratiot Park that had asphalt-paved walkways that were ideal for such. I enjoyed occasional trips downtown on the elevated train where we visited the Museum of Natural History, the Science Museum, and even looked at the lake shore, and I enjoyed living close to cousins Bob and Ken Kinsey and Sally Lehman. While we were living in Chicago, we attended the First Church of the Brethren that was about 2 blocks away from Grandpa Slabaugh's apartment building at 3446 Van Buren Street. My paternal grandfather, Warren William Slabaugh, was a professor and briefly as president of the Bethany Biblical Seminary in Chicago, right across the street from where he lived. Bethany served as a seminary for the Church of the Brethren and the Mennonite denomination. My maternal grandfather, George Willie Bowman, occasionally served as a lay preacher at the First Church. My aunts and uncles all seemed to practice the Brethren faith, except perhaps for one, Uncle Bill, my dad's older brother. He was my favorite uncle, probably because he did not have his own kids at the time, and he played with us, bought us treats, and seemed to enjoy our company as much as we enjoyed his. While growing up, I was interested in his not being religious, as I heard he didn't go to church, and I was fascinated that he smoked. He probably started it, like many adolescents, because it was cool, but possibly because nobody else in his family did. At Thanksgiving time in 1942, we moved to Port Huron, Michigan, only a block away from where Lake Huron flows into the St. Clair River. My dad got a job teaching chemistry at the local junior college. His previous boss at Lockport was upset with him for leaving his teaching post in the midst of the school year, but Dad reminded him that he had promised housing but did not provide such. In Port Huron, we lived about 5 blocks away from the elementary school where I did the rest of my 3rd grade and 4th and 5th. I have a picture of myself with my safety patrol belt on. I think I was a member of that group during 5th and 6th grade. I can't remember 6th grade at all, other than that, but had my first male public school teacher for 7th grade in a nearby junior high school. He must have been fond of me because later he paid me to babysit his 2 small children. In Port Huron, I have good memories of many walks down the street to the river to swim and many summer days spent on the beach, which was only about 2 blocks away, and sledding in wintertime at a park that was close by. My parents trusted me and my brothers to swim in the lake and the St. Clair River, and I remember no close calls while doing so. But I do remember worrying about my parents when they would occasionally swim out into the strong current of the river. Further down the river, there were huge boulders that had been hauled in to line the banks of the river. It was a grand place for me to explore and hide. There I had my first cigarette, but I can't remember if it was a store-bought or homemade with corn silk. I know we occasionally used corn silk because one time we had some drying on the roof on the far side of the garage, and as our whole family was walking home from church, my dad spotted the stuff. Fortunately, he seemed to forget about it before he went to investigate. It was about this time that I did something so shameful I have never forgotten it. I was in a store, and I stuck a little toy Jeep in my pocket. I planned to steal it. A teenager saw me do it and called out, "I saw you do that." I shamefacedly put it back. We were able to walk to school and to a Methodist church, as there was no Church of the Brethren in Port Huron. We did a lot of walking since this was during World War II, and gas rationing limited the driving Dad could do. I do remember him driving me and Jim to his workplace. The Mueller Brass Company, where he worked as a chemist after the junior college, shut down because most of their students had been drafted. I remember vividly his showing us a device that tested the strength of various metals. He put in a rod of steel, and the machine pulled it apart with a really loud bang. Another adventure in Port Huron was building a boat. Jim, Paul, and I patched together a boat of sorts, towing it from home to the beach on a wagon, towing it back to patch leaks, and towing it back for the launch. But up the beach came several Coast Guardsmen with axes. They proceeded to chop up our craft, probably not wanting to have to rescue little kids at the entrance to a fast-flowing river. I think I was in 5th grade when I first began to notice girls. It was the time of World War II, and there was a housing shortage, and so my parents let another family live with us. They had 2 little girls, and once my brothers and I played doctor with them. We didn't do anything other than undress them, but it certainly was part of my education. In March 1946, my family moved to a farm about 15 miles west of Rockford, Illinois. About this time, I was baptized in Chicago at my grandparents' church. The baptism took place in a room directly in front of the church above the altar, hidden ordinarily by curtains or cabinet-like doors, but open to be visible by the congregation during those specific ceremonies. The baptismal was like a very small swimming pool, about 4 feet by 6 feet, and about 4 feet deep, with 2 sets of stairs going down into the water. The pastor would enter by a side door that led back to the meeting hall, and those to be baptized wearing white gowns or pajama-type outfits were in adjoining dressing rooms. There were 2 of us baptized that day, my red-headed cousin Sally, who was about 15 and beautiful, and me, fascinated. I could see her ritual from my dressing room, watching her being dunked 3 times. The word dunkers often used to tease the brethren. And then I watched her climb out of the pool, her wet gown sticking closely to her body. It was then my turn to walk to the tank for my baptism, but for some reason I was very tense. Perhaps that was the reason my baptism didn't take. Obviously, it was a memorable experience. The farm we moved to was generally an enjoyable place to live. It was big for the time and place, 550 acres. It was owned by my Uncle Curtis, who had encouraged my dad to leave teaching, manage the farm, and have a good place to raise his 5 boys. It was hard on my dad with all the physical labor, the dust, dirt, and filth from the animals and their feed, and the need to be around 7 days a week to milk cows twice a day. It was hard on my mother because initially the house had no indoor plumbing, a primitive heating system, a primitive kitchen, and she had to carry the laundry down into a dingy, dark basement to the washing machine, and then up the outside steps to the clotheslines. A job I often had was to carry the wash down and out and hang it up. I also helped Mother with house cleaning and washing dishes. To Dad's credit, one of the first things he did was put in a full bathroom upstairs and a small bathroom adjacent to the kitchen. For the rest of 7th grade and all of 8th grade, I attended a one-room school in Harrison, Illinois, about a mile from the farm. There was no bus service for that school, and we often had to walk. My first girlfriend, Carol Wimsman, was about 6 years younger than I, and I would often walk her home as she lived right along my route home. I suspect her mother may have questioned my motives, but they were innocent. I think I treated her like a little sister. In 8th grade, in the one-room school in Harrison, I was one of 4 or 5 older boys who were mischievous at best. Our teacher, Mrs. Clark, was an old lady whose pay was probably a pittance and who seemed to have no control over our behavior. We occasionally skipped school on nice days and went down to the river, but I don't think she ever reported such to our parents. She was probably happy to get rid of us. but it was a wasted year for me educationally, I think. My main tasks on the farm were taking care of the animals and doing field work. I belonged to the local 4-H club, and I had projects raising black Australorp chickens, Duroc pigs, and doing gardening. Dad often told others that I did a really good job of taking care of my rows of vegetables, but it was a chore I didn't enjoy all that much, and perhaps that is why I never did much gardening for the rest of my life. My least favorite part of the farm was milking the cows. Dad and Uncle Curtis were early users of a milking parlor, where we would let 8 cows in, get them all into their stanchions, put milking machines on 4 of the cows after cleaning their teats, and as the first 4 were being milked, we would ready the next 4 for milking. That procedure was repeated until they were all milked. My brother Richard, who probably did more milking than any of his brothers, thought the most cows we milked was about 66, and Paul remembered 60. I remember that any number was too many. On the farm, I often would trade milking for throwing down silage or doing field work on the tractor. Cultivating corn was my favorite task. Driving the tractor was easy enough, and you could easily see what you were accomplishing. It also helped me to easily learn to drive cars and trucks. I first learned to drive an old Farmall F20 that had a 2-row cultivator that had to be raised and lowered by hand, and that was difficult for me to do. That tractor also had a nasty characteristic of violently swiveling the front wheels if it hit an obstruction, and could easily injure your hand. But Dad and Uncle Curtis bought a new Alish Chalmers WD-40 tractor that had a power lift for the cultivator, and it was a joy for this kid. But a later joy was a new Farmall M diesel, which had a 4-row cultivator. Much later, newer machines were 16-row giants. But now most farmers don't even cultivate. They use a low tillage procedure that is more efficient and ecologically viable. The most enjoyable part of cultivating corn was that you could think about all sorts of things. I suspect I spent most of my time thinking about Shirley Kelsey, a pretty high school classmate. Now, as an old man, I enjoy driving my John Deere lawnmower, but if I daydream as I ride, it seems it is usually about needing to fix something rather than thinking about pretty girls. In retrospect, some of my high school education, too, was subpar. I attended a very small high school in Durand, graduating in 1951 with 21 others. I was considered a good student, but I remember thinking that I was never as good a student as my older brother Jim was. Our parents, both well educated, used proper grammar, so generally I did too. So I think I got by in English classes without learning the parts of speech. My science and biology teacher was Miss Reinbach, who had little classroom control and was later institutionalized for mental illness. She was an object of ridicule to many of her students, and I later felt she was generally incompetent as a teacher. I think my agricultural teacher, Elwyn Wilson, favored me, perhaps influencing my election as president of the Future Farmers of America. But I really didn't enjoy farming, especially milking the cows, and I quit agriculture class the middle of my junior year. I did play basketball one year, but being a shorter kid, I was kept in the second tier. But one night I got hot and couldn't seem to miss a move or a basket, but I got a pain in my side, probably from overexertion, and thinking that I should tell the coach such for the good of the team, he angrily took me out and didn't put me back in again. The coach was also my history teacher, and in retrospect, was not an effective educator. I didn't like history until my sophomore year in college, when I had a good guy, Professor Neil Merritt, teaching it. I've enjoyed reading history ever since. While we lived on the farm, we attended the First Church of the Brethren in Rockford. I really enjoyed my church youth group there and made best friends there. We also often had family company, including my attractive cousins Mary and Peel Bowman and Sally Lehman, and they would often bring other attractive young females with them. It was a nice change from the ordinary life with only brothers. My first girlfriend of my own age was Shirley Wisner from Mount Morris, Illinois, who I met at church camp. She was very pretty, about as tall as I was, and it was my first crush. But I was very shy, it seemed in retrospect, and the most intimate I got with her was to hold her hand. At that camp, I also met Ralph McFadden and Dave Joyner, who later became good friends. My first steady girlfriend was Shirley Albertus, a fellow junior at Durand High School. Our first date was for the junior prom after she was elected prom queen, and then I was elected prom king. I suspect that I was elected because she had been elected first, and many of her friends thought I would be a good partner for her. We had only a few dates, but I was too shy to even kiss her until our last date. I have felt somewhat ashamed ever since about the way I treated her, but I am now aware of how perhaps most adolescents often act less than rationally. After breaking up with Shirley Albertus, I dated fellow classmates Shirley Kelsey, Margie Goldie, Joyce Nyman, and Shirley Blunt. I also took my brother Jim Steady, Kay Moore, to the senior prom because Jim was off at college and both Kay and I needed a date. We did a lot of kissing, and I remember her saying that she had to choose between brothers, but I remained loyal to Jim. I think I fantasized more about Shirley Kelsey than any other girl, but only got to date her between her breakups with the jocks. I really enjoyed kissing all these girls, but that was as intimate as I got with any until I became engaged to be married. At the church in Rockford, I became close friends with Larry Stewart, who later brought his family to live close to us on Spring Creek Road, and Russell May. Each of them had girlfriends, Peggy Burgard and Joan Eby, who were in our group, and they fixed me up with Kay Nelson, another group member, who became my second steady girlfriend. I guess she had been attracted to me for some time, but I was shy and oblivious, so it took the others to get me motivated. Kay Nelson was a cheerleader at West High School in Rockford and a real beauty. Because she lived in Rockford and I lived miles away and went to Durand High School and had limited access to my dad's cars, we did not see each other all that often. Perhaps my most vivid memory of the time was when the two of us in Dad's car went to an A&W drive-in for root beers, and I drove off taking the glass mugs with us. Out of the rearview mirror, I saw the proprietor run out to his car in pursuit. I was not too far from Kay's house, which was just over the top of the hill, and I squealed into their circular driveway that went behind her house. I then heard the A&W guy roar past, and a few minutes later speed past, apparently returning to his workplace. It became another guilt trip for me. In the summer of 1950, Darrell Smucker and I and another friend went swimming and diving in the Sugar River behind our farm, and Darrell badly injured his spinal cord, causing his death about 6 months later. It was my first profound experience with the death of a loved one. It also increased my love and respect for my older brother Jim, who was attending Manchester College during most of the time of Darrell's incapacity. Because Darrell could not use his fingers, but his speech and reasoning power were still good, he could play cards but not handle them. So Jim made a device with numbered, on both sides, slots to hold the playing cards. Darrell could just say the number of the card he wanted played, and another player could select it and play it. It was ingenious. That seemed to help Darrell pass some of his short remaining time more enjoyably. After graduating from Durand High School in 1951, I started college at North Manchester, Indiana, where my older brother Jim, my friend Ralph McFadden, and cousin Mary Bowman were attending. My dad and his sister Helen had both graduated there too. It was my first experience of being away from home and parents, and perhaps my first experiences of feeling lonely. I aspired to be a medical doctor and started the pre-med courses, but also flunked out that first year. I was competing with others who had attended better high schools that offered chemistry and other courses that might have prepared me for the pre-med curriculum. I should have learned English parts of speech in elementary and high school, but I didn't. So, after years of being a good student, my freshman year in college was a minor disaster. But other than being frustrated with my academic performance, I enjoyed almost everything else. I aspired to be a member of the a cappella choir with Jim and Ralph, but, lacking their skills, I only was able to join the men's glee club. During that freshman year, I received a Dear John letter from Kay Nelson and was devastated briefly. But the high point of the year occurred when I met Marcia Haney, who also was a member of the a cappella choir. We both were members of the Octo Rolo Skating Club and were paired to skate together. I became immediately attracted to her. I proposed to her on our third date. We had only a month or so before summer break and were together as much as possible. Loneliness ceased to be a problem for me. During that summer, we corresponded almost daily by letters. I don't recall ever using the telephone to do so, but I didn't get to see her at all until school started that fall. Late in the summer, my dad and I drove down to Manchester College to get me admitted on a probationary status. Fortunately, the dean, David Yeater, was an old friend of Dad's. They sat and talked about old times for almost an hour while I sat there sweating. But lastly, they only briefly mentioned my academic problems, and the dean suggested I switch from the pre-med courses. That was one of my fondest memories of Dad. That sophomore year was probably the happiest of formal schooling for me. I had good jobs setting pins at the local bowling alley and washing dishes at the college cafeteria. I spent a little time with my brother Jim and my cousin Bob Kinsey and friend Ralph, but most of my time with Marcy. We would almost daily meet early in the morning at the women's dorm, Oakwood Hall, in the lounge, usually deserted at that time, have devotions, the quicker the better, I thought, and then do some great petting. During the rest of the day that I was not with her, it seemed that I spent much of my time thinking about her. The next summer, I worked on the farm, had the opportunity to drive Dad's 1950 Chrysler New Yorker down to visit Marcy, later bought my first car, a 1941 Dodge four-door sedan, and Marcy came to visit me. It was the first time we had sex together, and a wonderful experience for me. Her too, I think. Dad took me shopping to buy a new suit and had to sign my marriage license because I was just 20 years old, not the required age of 21. Marcy and I were married on August 30th, 1953, in Bremen, Indiana, in the Evangelical United Brethren Church that Marcy and her folks attended. It was a hot, humid day, but I didn't seem to notice that. Our parents and all our siblings and many aunts and uncles and cousins attended. Marcy's college roommate was her maid of honor, my brother Jim was my best man, and Ralph McFadden sang for us. We honeymooned at White Pigeon, Michigan, where we stayed in a little cabin by a lake. One incident, other than marital bliss, that I recall was when we shopped at a small general store for groceries and made small talk with the proprietor. I told him we had just been married the day before, and he asked me what church I attended. Church of the Brethren, I replied. Then he asked if Marcy was saved. I thought he asked if she was the same, so I replied, no, she's Evangelical United Brethren. My mistake. I returned to college for my junior and senior years, and Marcy began her teaching career at Huntington, Indiana. I was definitely a happy man. I don't recall any domestic quarrels, and our marriage seemed ideal. We rented an upstairs apartment there in Huntington from an old widow, Miss Plasterer, who had been married to an Erie railroad engineer. Marcy could walk to her teaching job there in Huntington, and I would drive on to Manchester College about 16 miles away. Perhaps the first blip in my happy marriage occurred that year at college, probably within the first month, when I would study in the library before my first class started. A pretty freshman or sophomore was usually present. I don't think I ever as much as spoke to her and cannot remember her name, but the feeling I had, lust, made me feel guilty. She was the first girl after my marriage that I lusted after. I still think about that after more than 63 years. I guess I have something in common with President Carter: lust. Lust was and is often seen as an evil trait, using the Bible as a guide, but the Bible also says that God created the world and the people in it, so did not God cause most humans to have sexual desires? As I matured, I learned that I, as a human being, am a mammal, and just as probably all of the other animals of this world, we have instincts. To describe one or two instincts as evil seems wrong to me. We just need to try to control our actions. I perhaps just needed to try to control my thoughts. The following summer, we bought a mobile home located in a small trailer park near downtown Huntington on the Wabash River. It was a small, about 63-foot long, but for a honeymooning couple, it was great. It was the first home that I owned. I don't recall that I had any responsibilities for caring for the small lawn or doing snow shoveling, but I probably had to do some of the latter. I took care of one of Marcy's fellow teachers' garden that summer while that lady traveled overseas. I had some experience gardening on the farm, and my folks said that I did a really good job on my assigned rows, but I did a terrible job on that teacher's garden. I let it grow, almost totally neglecting it. So about the time she came back from overseas, I really got busy. I borrowed a county mower that was left overnight nearby and just mowed down the garden. I still am chagrined at my lack of responsibility, her garden. It was another example of how I cannot seem to get over my lapses of proper behavior. Part of that may have been a reflection of my childhood responsibilities of caring for rows in Dad's garden and not being fond of that at all. I later read in Lincoln's biographies that he did not enjoy the farm work his dad forced upon him. And when he bought his first and only home in Illinois, he seemed to pay scant attention to gardening and planting trees and shrubs. I graduated from Manchester College in May of 1955 and was able to have my first year of teaching at Lancaster Township School, where I had 6 preparations to teach English and history. Because of my incompetence, English grammar, Marcy would tutor me before I attempted to teach it. I felt much more competent teaching history. Lancaster School was only about 5 miles away from our home, so I would drive Marcy to her school, which is about half a mile away from our trailer home in Huntington. Then I would drive on to my school. The main memory I have of any of the students there was a field trip I took with my 8th graders to one of the girls' farm home, where her parents were busy gathering sap for maple syrup. It was an enjoyable, easy year for me, but we made no close friends there in Huntington. In the spring of 1956, I received my draft notice. I had some reservations about being in the military. Both sides of my family were members of the Church of the Brethren, generally pacifists. I may have been the first one in many generations in my family to serve in the military. My religious upbringing exposed me to pacifism, but my knowledge of history made me think that military service was not necessarily dishonorable or evil. It was luck that made it possible for me to finish college and teach 1 year before I had to go into the military. My older brother Jim did not have to face military service because he was in training for the ministry and then served as such. My brother Paul faced the draft but was married with a family, so received a family deferment. My brother Richard stayed with the family tradition and requested a conscientious objector deferment. He received one and served at the Mayo Clinic instead of the military. He was lucky in that during that time he got interested in the theater, met his future wife Jan, and started work on his master's degree in theater arts. My brother David, after his college graduation, was a University of Maryland contract employee with the military in Korea dealing with military education, and this position made him exempt from the draft. He and his wife, Marion, later adopted 2 Korean boys, Michael and Ted. My youngest brother, Stephen, has a mild form of cerebral palsy, and that kept him out of the military. So, after receiving my draft notice, I consulted a recruiter and was told that I could choose the advanced training of my choice if I would enlist for 3 years. I chose the Army Intelligence Corps. I enlisted, but later, to my chagrin, I found that almost all of my classmates there had, just like me, graduated from college. But I would have an extra year of service tacked on. The Korean War was over, but the Cold War with the Soviet Union was in full swing, and the war in Vietnam not started in the U.S. I took the longest bus ride I had ever had to Fort Leonard Wood, Missouri for basic training. There I met some of the most unsavory characters I have ever known. My platoon sergeant, Sergeant Jackson, seemed to be fond of harassing me and 2 others, calling us college boys. One of the other college grads, who had majored in pre-dentistry, was a squad leader in our platoon. He was bashed in the mouth, losing several of his front teeth by a fellow recruit. I escaped some of that unpleasantness by becoming the company clerk. That allowed me to escape some of the longer hikes and routine boring classes, but caused me to miss pistol and machine gun training, which I probably would have enjoyed. The office environment was usually more pleasant than being outside in the heat with my overheated fellow recruits. So after 20 years of living at home with my parents, or being in my first 2 years of college and 3 years of marriage while finishing college and teaching school 1 year, was suddenly in the unhappiest period of my life until then, basic training. It was a time without friends and family, and Missouri in June, July, and August of 1956, and probably almost every summer before and after, was hot, humid, and miserable. One memorable experience I had while in basic training was a 20-mile hike with full gear. I carried half a pup tent and was paired with a guy who carried the other half of the tent. We arrived at our bivouac site and were warned to watch out for an enemy attack using poison gas. We put up our tent, leaving the end flaps open because of the heat and humidity, and I fell into an exhausted sleep. I suddenly awoke to the moonlit sight of the clouds billowing from an approaching thunderstorm. It seemed to be a cloud of poison gas to me, so I woke up the whole camp yelling, "Gas!" Perhaps only my tent mate knew it was me who gave the alarm, but it would have been a good thing that I woke him, since we would then have time to fasten up the tent prior to the rain pouring down. I went back to sleep, but awoke when I realized someone was trying to steal my rifle. I grabbed the guy's arm, and he let out a scared yell. It was my tent mate moving my rifle out of the water to higher ground inside the tent. He must then have thought for sure that I was crazy. The only great experience I remember during basic training was when Marcy came to visit. It probably was not so good for Marcy because she did not care to drive too much distance by herself, and she had to drive from Huntington, Indiana to Rolla, Missouri, and back. But she made an effort and seemed to enjoy our time together. It was a wonderful weekend in the midst of a bad summer. After basic training in Missouri, I was assigned to the Army Intelligence School at Fort Holabird in Baltimore, Maryland. I had a trailer hitch installed on my Buick and towed our house from Indiana to Baltimore. In retrospect, it was not a smart thing to do, but I had such fond memories of our living in that small house trailer in Huntington and thought it would be enjoyable to be in the same house, so to speak. We were fortunate to find a nice spot to park it in a trailer park near Sparrows Point on Chesapeake Bay. I had relatively little maintenance work to do, except that while in Baltimore, I did repaint the exterior of the trailer. In wintertime, heavy snow there was rare, so I had little shoveling to do. Our yard was so small that mowing it just took a few minutes. We lived there nearly 3 years, and in most ways, it was an idyllic time. Marcy was teaching first grade there in a public school, and I was getting military pay and often substitute teaching pay, and the military paid for our medical expenses. It was probably the time we saved the most money in relation to our total income. Our first son, Gary's birth, was on May 19, 1957, in Aberdeen, Maryland, at the Aberdeen Proving Ground Military Hospital. He was a good baby. One traumatic event that I recall was that he cried and cried one night and we discovered a bed bug bite. It turned out that his babysitter's trailer was infected and the infection was transferred with the bedding. It was not difficult to take care of the problem. I occasionally changed his diaper and enjoyed feeding and playing with him. When he learned to walk, I do remember often playing with my son out near the water and have pictures of our joy. I liked being a dad. I probably spent more time being a dad with Gary than I did with his siblings. I have since read that it is typical in our culture to give most attention to the oldest. I met John Stone and Bill Powers at Fort Holabird, and I later invited them and their wives, both named Judy, to our home. We often had parties there because our little house trailer was roomier than Bill and Judy's apartment and more convenient and private than John and Judy's. These were the times I first used alcohol to any extent, and it seemed to liven things up. But that insidious trait of lust was directed at Judy Stone, a stunning beauty. We named our daughter Judy. During Thanksgiving vacation in 1956, the 6 of us drove our 1953 Buick Special 4-door sedan down to Coral Gables, Florida. and stayed at Judy Stone's mother's home. We rented a boat and scuba diving gear for 6 and went out with John in charge. He was the only one, perhaps, who had driven a powerboat and had experience with scuba diving. He and I were the only ones who used up full tanks of air, and the girls briefly or not at all. After our first tanks emptied, John quit diving and started fishing, and I proceeded to use up the air in the other 4 tanks. At one point, John's line got stuck, he thought. He asked me to follow it down, as I did, and I found that it was leading into a hole in the coral rocks, and a big moray eel was guarding it. Somehow, I got the line free, but it was an adventure. The wind was picking up, and the waves getting bigger, and I think about everyone except John, and I got seasick. I was feeling superior about not being seasick on the trip back to the dock, but I had been in and under the water most of the time up to that point. So shortly after starting back to shore, I got seasick too. Pride goeth before a fall. Another event there was in Miami Beach, for which John, Bill, and I dressed in tuxedos. Me for the first time. The girls were beautifully dressed, and I drove my Buick to a really fancy resort there. Never having worn a tuxedo or cummerbund before, I accidentally tucked my billfold into the cummerbund instead of a back pocket, and I lost it in a parking lot. I did not miss it until our visit was almost over and was distraught by the idea that my money, credit card, and driver's license would be gone for the rest of the trip. But when I reported in to get my car, I found out that an attendant had found it, promptly reported it to his superiors, and they waited for someone to come claim it. Luck. During Christmas vacation in 1956, Marcy and I drove back to Illinois in our Buick, accompanied by Bud and Shirley Lance, who were also at Fort Holabird in Baltimore. I had met Shirley at church camp near Mount Morris, Illinois, when I was a sophomore or junior in high school, and then again when she went to Manchester College, where we both met Bud, who was a classmate of mine at Manchester, although I did not associate much with him either at college or in Baltimore. The studies, and later the assignments in the Army, were not unpleasant and usually interesting and helpful. One of the main benefits of the intelligence school training I received was in interrogation. Later, as an elementary school principal, I often had to question naughty little kids, and questioning technique became very important. At Fort Holabird, my job was in the Office of Grades and Records. I suspect I was positioned there because I had already had a year of teaching. It was a routine, boring job that often involved make work. But I could do it all quickly and efficiently and was able often to get passes to substitute teach in the local high and middle schools. My immediate supervisor was a civilian employee, Estelle Diggins, about 10 or 20 years older than me, who seemed to be enamored with my military boss, a captain. They often spent long hours together in the break room drinking coffee and chatting and whatever. I would have enjoyed doing the same with a young pretty civilian employee who worked in an adjoining office, but for some reason our time together was much more limited. She attracted all sorts of other guys who liked her company. I never tried to conceal that I was married, and I tried to avoid taking a break with her when she had the opportunity to be with other guys, but lust seemed to be ever present. Perhaps my captain gave me all the passes because my apparent discretion, Miss Diggins. One foolish thing I did at Fort Holabird, in retrospect, was joining the Honor Guard. I figured it would be a lot easier to carry a guidon, a flag with a company logo, than a rifle, but I did not realize that I would have to march in the preliminary parade. So I had to spend a lot more time carrying the flag than my fellows did carrying their rifles, except for a few riflemen, who also had to march in the preliminary parade. An interesting part of my job was that I was a part-time actor. We were training young intelligence agents, mostly second lieutenants. I would dress up as an enemy agent and was given a script and itinerary. Once I was playing a really bad guy and was being interviewed by a student agent who was very leery of me and kept his fake pistol leveled at me while he attempted to write down the fake information I was amply feeding him. I kept that up, and he was so busy writing that he laid his pistol down on his knee in order to write faster. He asked me if I knew the character I was playing, and I replied, "There he is right back there." He turned to look, and I grabbed his fake gun and shot him. Later, my captain chided me by saying, How is he going to learn to interrogate if you kill him? I thought to myself that he must have learned something. As an actor, I was often given suits to wear, and was very fond of a beige suit I was scheduled to wear. So one day after the last session, I turned in a ratty plaid suit I owned for years instead of the Army's beige one. The low-level enlisted man who received and passed out the outfits asked, "Is this beige?" I replied, "Sure." I wore my beige suit for years during the 50s and 60s. I was right in style. In June of 1958, all of my Army buddies got to go back home to Stone's in Madison, Wisconsin, and the Powers to the Detroit area. But there was a teacher shortage at the time, and the Maryland school needed them badly, and the Army didn't really need me in my Doolittle job, so I got an early release in late August to teach full-time at Sparrows Point High School. I served in the military for 27 months and 2 days. Anyone released after 27 months of active service did not have to serve in the active reserves. So I was free in any reserve duty. But many of my peers had to devote 2 weeks of every summer for 7 years, so I ended up serving about the same amount of time, but had my summers free. It was another example of the good luck I had in my life. After my year of teaching history at Sparrows Point High School, Marcy and I and our 2-year-old son Gary moved to Loves Park, Illinois, a suburb of Rockford. I probably made the dumbest mistake of my life, not involving love, lust, or religion, by buying a used truck to tow our house trailer. Hauling that trailer from Maryland to Illinois and realizing it was too small for our family of 4 to live in was at least a stupid decision. Marcy, who was pregnant, drove our Buick, towing the Fiat with little Gary, and I drove the truck. My brother Paul, after we arrived, said I should get rid of the trailer house, citing the fact that Illinois was prone to tornadoes, and that mobile homes are more vulnerable to disaster than conventional dwellings. It was good advice, and we followed it. We moved into the upstairs apartment of Paul's house on Wallace Avenue in Loves Park. There, in Illinois, our daughter Judy was born October 24th, 1959, at Rockford Memorial Hospital. Paul's wife Donna was especially helpful to Marcy with the baby. I was much less involved with Judy's care compared to how active I had been with Gary, perhaps because I was much busier with my teaching and remodeling work. Judy was a beautiful baby and has been a delightful daughter. Sputnik had been launched about 3 weeks before Judy's birth, and we used the rear flat roof that was probably intended originally to be a deck for our apartment to see the rocket tumbling across the night sky. It was a great place to observe that historic event. That winter, when I had 2 weeks off for Christmas and New Year's, we took the Great Northern Railway trip from Byron, a small town southwest of Rockford, out to La Grande, Oregon, to visit my folks who had been living there for 2 years. The train cars had upstairs observation decks to observe the scenery, and I remember the trip well. It was the only long train trip I ever had. An incident I remember well, and Paul enjoys telling it when we are together with company, was when one spring day I saw that Donna had just washed her windows there on Wallace Avenue. I then decided to wash our upstairs windows, drug out the hose, and wash them down, the dirty water going over Donna's clean windows. Paul and Donna and their 2 boys, Bob and Ronnie, moved away to Cherry Valley shortly after that. I hope my window washing actions did not contribute to their decision. My first year as a teacher in Illinois was teaching history at Harlem High School for 1 year in 1959 to 1960. I think my most vivid memory of that year was that I would occasionally get sleepy in the afternoon, and one time I started nodding off, and I saw a girl hiding her amusement. So, after that, if I would get tired, I would get out of my chair and pace in front of the room. The most significant aspect of that year in teaching was getting acquainted with my supervisors and numerous fellow teachers, some of whom became fellow principals, and making the decision to try to become a principal myself. I consulted my superintendent, Carl Dannenfeld, about becoming a principal. It turned out to be a milestone in my career. Later, I realized that being a principal seemed not to present the opportunities to develop more meaningful relationships with students, as my dad and wife Betsy, as teachers, were certainly able to do. The extra time needed for evening meetings and students' programs really was less than the additional time classroom teachers need to properly prepare lesson plans, so being an administrator was easier. All in all, I enjoyed my career. I started teaching at the elementary level in 1960. My principal at Marquette Elementary School was Mildred Kissel. She was aware of my interest in becoming a principal and was friendly and helpful. She would often make me head teacher to take over some of her responsibilities at Marquette School when she had to travel elsewhere for meetings. I became good friends with Kathy Schnur, a fellow 6th grade teacher, and Joyce Raymer, who taught 5th. I lusted after Kathy but made no overt approaches. She later moved to La Crosse, Wisconsin to teach and married an elementary principal there. I had a good intellectual relationship with Joyce. She often joined our group in later years for happy hours, and after she and her husband moved to Florida, we would correspond occasionally by phone and letters. I needed to attend night school at Northern Illinois University at DeKalb, Illinois to get my master's degree with the right credentials for a supervisory position. I recall my initial years at NIU often in my dreams because essentially that was the largest institution I had ever been involved with, and I attended regularly only at night. There was one daytime I had to go there, but the campus was so big and complicated that I had real trouble finding the office that I was looking for. So, for about 60 years in my dreams, I am lost in the big city or office complex, and it was only relatively recently that I realized that those repetitious dreams came from my experience at DeKalb. I am not proud of my advanced degree. I generally did not enjoy the classes. My thesis for my master's degree was a history of the Harlem School District. I simply put together information that I gleaned from old newspapers, and I interviewed a few of the contemporary administrators and teachers. I do not think my thesis enhanced my ability to be a good elementary school principal. I do think my teaching experience prior to becoming an administrator was of much more importance, as was having role models, good and bad, to learn from. In 1961, my brother Paul bought a lot on Riverside Drive across the road from a dump in Loves Park. Because the location was so close to the dump, it only cost $700 and he subdivided it into 4 lots. He bought 3 houses and I bought one for $500 for the building and $4,500 to move it to a new location. My house was located at 1225 Clifford Avenue, and I worked many hours getting it ready to rent. Years later, the dump was closed and the area was turned into a golf driving range and a public park, including a swimming pool. So, my investment was greatly enhanced. Luck. I needed to spend a considerable amount of my free time that year working on my Clifford Avenue house, getting it ready to rent out. That fall, I rented it to an elderly couple who stayed there for nearly 7 years. It was a steady source of additional income, and the tax laws were such that I could honestly list deductions that allowed me to lower my federal taxes. I mortgaged the property and would use the equity for many years thereafter to finance new real estate ventures. More luck. Our third child, William Glenn, named after his paternal grandfather Glenn William, was born on January 28, 1961. It was a difficult delivery for Marcy as she endured the cesarean section procedure. We were still living at Wallace Avenue in Paul's upstairs apartment, so stairs were an additional difficulty for her. Late in that summer, we moved to our new home on Spring Creek Road. So, having a new baby and 2 other very young children to care for was not easy for her. I was busy as a new principal, moving all our stuff to our new home and making repairs and improvements to it. I spent much less time helping take care of my 2 youngest children than I had with the older 2. I remember fondly Billy's curiosity and playfulness, especially when I was doing yard work. I bought child-sized tools for him to use, and we would use them exuberantly for a while. In 1962, I bought a beautiful lot on Spring Creek Road in Rockford. The north boundary was essentially a little creek lined with small trees and other plants, which had many wonderful animals. I sold the west half of it to Paul and Donna. They bought the old two-room Bell School building, moved it to the Spring Creek location, and remodeled it into a beautiful residence. Later, they added a swimming pool, and we moved a small garage onto my property next to the pool that we converted into a combination dressing room, pump room, and restroom. I bought an old farmhouse located about 2 blocks away from Norman and Ann Meyer, and had inherited the farm, which had been in her family for several generations. They built a new house, and I bought the old one for $500. It was probably built about 1880 there on Bell School Road. Paul moved it to my lot, and that was where my children grew up. I spent much of my spare time for years remodeling the kitchen, putting in a small new bathroom upstairs, planting hundreds of shrubs and trees, and even had a tennis court built. I bought a used Cub Cadet tractor and a used 4-section mower that I could tow behind, and enjoyed mowing the lawns, often towing behind the mower 3 or more wagons holding laughing children. When I was installing the plumbing in the wall below the new bathroom, I had to tear out the old lath and plaster. Down at the bottom of the opening was a child's shoe. It apparently was a little girl's high-topped, high-heeled boot circa the 19th century. I thought to myself, why is this here? Then I noticed an oval cut towards the top of the boot. Apparently, an older brother wanted to make a slingshot and used little sister's boot to fashion the leather sling, but then realized he might have to explain his actions, so he tossed the incriminating evidence down into the wall. I regret that I threw away that boot. It could have been an interesting display in the local museum. Our youngest son, Richard James, Ricky, was born on April 22, 1963. He is named after 2 of my brothers. I was in my 2nd year as a principal, anxious to do well in my job, and a vivid thing I remember about his birth is that I was at work at the time. Several of my teachers chided me for not being at the hospital. It might have been the first time I took personal time from my employment. I remember little of his infancy. In 1965, I bought another house in southeast Rockford and had Paul move it to Wellworth Avenue. I remodeled it extensively by turning the upstairs into an apartment. That involved putting in a new bathroom upstairs and doing much additional electrical wiring. However, I had to spend much of my free time doing that work generally by myself, and in retrospect, neglected my growing family. Marcy was very busy with our children, but she missed teaching. The public schools at the time did not offer kindergarten, so she started a private kindergarten there in our home. The tennis court became a paved playground. It also was a good tax write-off. Initially, she had only 7 students, including Gary, his cousin Ronnie, who lived next door, and Carrie Meyer, the daughter of our neighbors. In subsequent years, our children Judy and Bill were her students, as were Dan Meyer, Nadine Slabaugh, my brother Jim's youngest daughter, and Renee Fancher, the daughter of our first pastor at the Cillian Church. I next met Renee many years later at my 55th reunion at Manchester College. At a reception at the president's home, Renee McFadden, wife of the president, in greeting me, saw my name tag and said, "My kindergarten teacher in Rockford was named Slabaugh. Did you know her?" I asked Renee what school it was, and her reply was that it was in her teacher's home. So I could tell her I was intimately acquainted with her kindergarten teacher, my wife. My brother Jim built a new house next door on Spring Creek Road, and his family moved there in 1964. So, for a brief time, we 3 brothers lived in a row. Paul with a swimming pool, me with a tennis court, and Jim with a ground-level trampoline. It seemed to be an ideal setting. When we first moved to Illinois and were living upstairs in Paul's apartment house, our 2 families became members of a new congregation, the Sylvan Church of the Brethren on Rockford's east side, We considered attending the established Church of the Brethren on the west side where my folks and I and my brother attended while living on the farm, but it was not as close as the Sylvan Church. As loyal members, we tithed, attended regularly, and I recall that Donna and I paired to go out into the neighborhood to seek out new members. I was elected a deacon, taught adult Sunday school class, and was being groomed to become treasurer. It was a period of time of my life that I was most conventionally religious. I have no problem with other people wanting to go to church. If they feel they need to worship God, that is okay with me. I nearly always enjoyed the fellowship when I attended, and understand why others do too. But I was bothered by those who were so bigoted against blacks and denigrated those of us who agreed with evolutionary theory. And writing this in 2016, I am appalled with how so many of our citizens, many of whom seem to claim to be good Christians, are railing against Muslims, and many of these same people who are denying climate change, possibly the greatest threat facing humanity. Russ Irwin, who became a good friend of my parents when they moved to the farm in the 1940s, was the Sunday school superintendent at the Sylvan Church. He had been active in the established Church of the Brethren, located on the west side of Rockford, but he and his family lived on the east side of Rockford. Russ worked hard to make the new Sylvan Church successful. I admired him immensely, but he once criticized my teaching in the adult class when I departed from the prepared lesson plan, specifically when I added questions of my own that I wanted to discuss. That incident somewhat diminished my admiration of the man. But I was losing my faith. There seemed to be so many contradictions in the Bible. When the Sylvan Church lost its denominational monetary support, it folded. Marcy and the kids started attending the Spring Creek Congregational Church, and I quit going entirely except for occasional programs, weddings, and funerals. In retrospect, this was perhaps one of the biggest mistakes of my life. I did not consider how this would affect my children. I should have switched to the Unitarian Church where several of my good friends attended, and that church accepted non-believers. I suspect that Marcy would have joined it too. My first year as principal at Maple School in Loves Park starting in August 1962 was enjoyable for me. I particularly disliked long faculty meetings, so one of my innovations as a new principal was to have our meetings in the morning before school started, which forced us to end the meeting when the children were admitted to start classes. I met Curt Slabaugh, who was assigned there as an art teacher. We became good friends, and he introduced me to Darwin Wilcox, who became my best friend. Curt and Darwin had taught together at a junior high school there in Loves Park. Curt was a religious skeptic, which influenced me. He also was becoming involved with Francis, who he first met when he was 15 and a lifeguard at the YMCA, and that aroused my prurient interest. And in September of 1963, Betsy Johnson, a beautiful young teacher starting her second year, came to teach at Maple School. She often tells me how she was assigned to teach in Loves Park, but because of a bureaucratic mix-up, she was sent to Windsor School instead of Maple. The principal there haughtily sent her on to Maple, where I was principal. Betsy was fuming about the way she was received at Windsor, and thought that if she received a similar reception at Maple, she would quit immediately and go to another district. But I greeted her warmly and helped her take her stuff in, something I've been doing ever since, almost. But it was the beginning of a lifelong friendship that has grown into love. My second year as an elementary principal seems, in retrospect, to be one of my best years. I had a great family, a nice place to live, a good, enjoyable job, and seemed to have the approval and affection of nearly all of the people I was involved with. However, lust seemed to be becoming much more of a problem for me. Betsy was one of about 5 beautiful young teachers who were assigned to my building, and their physical attributes often seemed of most importance. That struck home the following year when another young gorgeous teacher was assigned to Maple School, but she often seemed mentally vacant and her teaching skills were generally poor. My mind, however, seemed to fixate primarily on her body, and of all of the other pretty women I would meet. This fixation, lust, seemed to dominate my life. I spent too much time reading and gazing at salacious material. Fantasies of involvement with other women were primary. My friendship with Curt Slabaugh was a key factor to this, as he shared his adventures of meeting, courting, and eventually marrying a new young wife. We also shared common views on religion. I believe my main failings at that time were that I was ignoring my marriage vows and my obligation to properly raising my children. These years were very busy times with my work to finish graduate work at Northern Illinois University, remodeling and maintaining my home on Spring Creek Road, managing and maintaining 2 rental properties, and trying to do a good job as principal at a big elementary school. In retrospect, a failing was a lack of involvement in an organization like a church that would involve me in an additional way with my family. It seemed my social activities were primarily for my own edification. Betsy became more important in my life. I admired her beauty, vivaciousness, physical talent, compatibility, and professional competence. I visited her classroom more often than any other, which I am sure was noticed by our peers and students. She encouraged me to learn to ski. My first visit to the Upper Peninsula of Michigan was with her and her husband, Dr. Richard Johnson. Marcy and I accompanied them on a ski trip, and I, for the first time, observed his drunken behavior on the bus. Betsy and I often played tennis and volleyball, and during school social activities, Betsy was my favorite colleague. I relied on her for suggestions regarding educational programs. Over the next several years, I became infatuated with her. We often socialized privately, especially when we commuted to DeKalb, when we were both working on our advanced degrees. Betsy's marriage was falling apart. Her husband was abusive, and he was failing in his profession. After a violent confrontation one night, she left him and moved in with a fellow teacher, Rose Simons. I and my friend Darwin, using his Chevrolet convertible, helped her move some of her things. I commiserated with her, and in doing so, I implied that I, too, was having a difficult marriage. Marcy and I did have a few problems, mainly regarding child rearing, but my own traits of lustfulness and a lack of commitment were probably the main causes. In the spring of 1968, I made serious plans to get a divorce. Betsy and I had socialized enough to think we were right for each other, and started making plans for a life together. We thought that living in Colorado would be great, especially for skiing. I started thinking that if I was living there, I would need to be able to get back to Illinois often to see my children. So I started taking flying lessons. Imagining that I could learn to fly and then within a few months be able to fly back and forth from Colorado to Illinois, however, was naive. I did not get the private pilot certificate before moving to Denver because I did not schedule enough time to do so. Also, I simply would not have been able to afford to buy or rent an airplane to do much flying. That summer, I separated from Marcy and rented a dingy apartment on Main Street in downtown Rockford, adjacent from the Sears store. Living alone for the first time in my life was terrible. My parents were visiting from Oregon, and they met with me and Marcy and Paul and Donna in their home on Spring Creek Road. My brother Jim was also present. They unanimously counseled me to preserve my marriage. Marcy indicated that she would try to overlook my marital indiscretions. In spite of this intervention and Marcy's concession, I proceeded to break up my marriage. My decision to get a divorce was traumatic for me and my family. In writing this, I asked Gary, Judy, and Bill what they remembered of the time. They all said that they did not remember that I had any talk with them about why I was divorcing their mother. They learned from her that we were getting divorced. They shared with me how their mother cried as she was giving them the news. Gary shared with me how he, from his upstairs bedroom, could often hear his mother and I arguing loudly, and how upsetting that was for him. Bill shared that after I left for Colorado, his mother seemed depressed, and how she had to cut back on buying things, and how she sometimes had to wait for the child support check. Betsy and I convoyed out of Denver, she in her Volkswagen Bug, and I in my '65 Ford Mustang. We rented separate apartments, got jobs teaching at the elementary level in 2 different schools. We were fortunate that there was a teaching shortage at the time because we had no difficulty in finding teaching positions. We socialized primarily with Pete and Gloria Kronquist, who had lived in Denver for several years. Prior to Pete's marriage, he was my best friend Darwin's roommate. Betsy and I skied often on weekends, occasionally with Pete and Gloria. Pete was selling real estate at the time, and I accompanied him by buying a lot in Colorado City. He bought several for himself, but later sold them. It turned out to be a poor investment for me. Living in Denver generally was not a happy time for me. If I shared information with new acquaintances about why I had left my family and community and quit my enjoyable job, it was at least awkward for me. I missed my home and children and friends in Rockford. I simply was not able to drive to Illinois from Denver and back on a weekend, so I only made one trip back prior to the Christmas, New Year's break, Thanksgiving. The skiing was enjoyable, but in retrospect, my living in Colorado was a big mistake. Betsy and I returned to Rockford for the 1968 Christmas vacation, and I made the decision to leave Colorado at the end of the semester in January. Betsy and I quit our jobs in Colorado, broke up our relationship for about 2 weeks, and moved back to Rockford. This breakup was traumatic for both of us. I moved back into my home on Spring Creek Road with my family. I started doing substitute teaching in Belvedere, Rockford, and Loves Park for several months before getting a full-time assigned teaching industrial arts at Washington Junior High School in the Rockford School District. Betsy went up to Ironwood to be with her mother and seek a job. There were no teaching jobs available there, so she decided to return to the Rockford area. She applied for a teaching position in the Rockford School District, got a position teaching 4th grade at Hallstrom School, and remained teaching there for over 20 years. Betsy got an apartment not too far from Hallstrom School. She immediately fit right into her new school situation. I was not pleased with substitute teaching. I regretted giving up my position as elementary principal at Maple School and moving out of Denver. I was pleased to be back with my children, but I was upset being away from Betsy. After just 2 weeks of being back in Rockford and being separated from Betsy, she and I got back together. I have often described my final breakup with Marcy as the worst time of my life. I had not treated her or Betsy or my children or my employers well. During the 2 weeks after my return to Rockford, Marcy seemed to try to do her best to please me in every way, but I just could not seem to break my relationship with Betsy. I vividly recall driving away from our Spring Creek home that day, fighting tears, and agonizing over my decision. It happened that my rental property at 1225 Clifford Avenue was vacant, so I started living there. Betsy had her apartment elsewhere, but essentially we started living together. We started a routine of having my children come over for most of the weekends and making our modest home a center for many social activities. As a couple, we associated mostly with our friends Darwin and Ellie. We also were visited by my friend Bill Powers, who was living in the Chicago area at that time. Kirk Showing, Darwin, and I formed a business partnership dealing primarily with IQ computers. They were electronic, mechanical amusement machines that you could play for a quarter. Betsy and I and Darwin and Ellie for many years would travel to the locations where we had the machines, collect the money, and then party. It was not particularly profitable, but made for another good deduction on my federal taxes. Curt sold his part of the partnership to Darwin and me after several years. In February of 1969, Marcy and I divorced. We had been married over 15 years. During that summer, I was made principal of 2 small elementary schools in Northwest Rockford, Elmwood, and Latham Park. In the fall of 1971, those 2 small schools were closed. Much to the consternation of many of the parents and students who attended, and all were consolidated to attend John T. Haight School, a new building nearby. I remained the principal at Haight for the next 13 years. During my first year as principal at Elmwood, Mike, David, and Christine Weiland were students there. They and their parents, Bob and Jerry, became lifelong friends with Betsy and me and my children. At Elmwood School, I started a weekly evening volleyball program for parents, students, and faculty and friends, and it continued throughout my tenure at Haight. It was one of my favorite activities, and Betsy and my children all participated, as did Darwin and Ellie and the Whalens. At Elmwood School, I met Steve Gosbeck, Richard Freeman, and Katie Adams Reverts, who have remained lifelong friends. Steve was our best volleyball player, and later encouraged some of us to join a city league. My secretary at Latham Park School, Audra Weldon, who became my first secretary at John T. Haight School, also has been a good friend and a good source of information. We were able to set up a computer classroom equipped with Commodore computers, perhaps the first one set up in our district in an elementary school. Steve was the most competent instructor regarding their use at our school and was most helpful to me in learning how to use them. He later became the computer coordinator for the district. At Elmwood School, the PTA had regular meetings and sponsored activities such as fun fairs and holiday programs. At one program, I dressed up as Liberus and played the piano. Betsy and Jerry Weiland were two of a chorus line called Slabaugh Sweeties. 3 other parents at Haight School joined Jerry and a teacher, Mary Ann Bearschmidt, and several others were in the chorus line. We gathered regularly after school on Wednesdays for Hump Day celebrations at a local bar, and it became a fixture for many years afterwards. We often then would do the same on Fridays too. On November 5th, 1970, Betsy and I were married. We had agreed to meet at the courthouse in Rockford after school on a Friday afternoon. Betsy arrived at the time we had planned, but I was delayed because buses were late at Elmwood School, and I had to remain on duty until that problem was taken care of. Betsy had informed the personnel in the clerk's office that she was waiting for me, and she waited and waited, aware that the others were thinking she had been stood up. But I did show up, and our relationship has lasted, with a few rocky interludes, for over 50 years. Betsy and I had decided that we would not buy a fancier home in the Rockford area, but reside until retirement at our modest home on Clifford Avenue. We would instead spend more on travel and recreation. The house had a small bathroom, kitchen, 3 bedrooms, and a full basement. I had plenty of room in the basement to store tools, paint, and some lumber. I remodeled the kitchen and bathroom with new fixtures and appliances and tore out a divider between the living room and the dining room. I bought a ping-pong table for the basement. After tearing out the divider and putting up a fake beam, we had a painting party and soon after a rug-laying party to cover up the old hardwood floor, marred by the absence of hardwood where the bases of the divider had been located. We had a small front yard facing the Barber Coleman Company facility across Clifford Avenue. The main entrance was there too, so often our street was very crowded with traffic. Our yard seemed just right for croquet, and we had many enjoyable games there. Our backyard was fenced in for our dog or dogs. We did not have enough room for a garden, but that was okay with me. That Christmas vacation time, we made the first of group trips to Colorado for skiing. Initially, we would stay with Pete and Gloria, and later with his second wife, Nyla Jean. Most of those ski trips were with Bob and Jerry, Steve and Linda, and Darwin and Ellie. Another couple that occasionally joined us was Steve and Prudy Court. During those years, I probably did more alcohol drinking than in any other period of my life. I am fortunate, however, to have a trait that after 2 or 3 drinks, I feel slightly nauseated and don't really want any more to drink, so I rarely drink too much. We and our friends often skied together at a few small resorts in northern Illinois and Wisconsin, but primarily in Michigan at Powderhorn Mountain Resort, which is only about 11 miles away from where we live now at Black River Harbor. Betsy had lived in the Ironwood area since her birth, and her mother and 3 brothers were located in the area. We often would stay at her mother's simple, somewhat primitive little home, occasionally jamming in more people than it would seem to hold. Betsy and I decided that after retirement we would like to permanently live up north at Ironwood. We had asked our friends Sharon Doom and Mary Nelson to let us know if any place at Black River Harbor came up for sale. When Curtis and Olive Bliss decided to sell in 1975, we purchased for $15,000 the home where we are still living. For the first 5 years, we owned the house. Betsy's mother, Mel, lived in it. Her old house was deteriorating, and she was delighted to be able to live in the same neighborhood for the last years of her life. Our home at Black River Harbor became our favorite vacation spot. We skied and snowshoed in winter and played tennis, swam in the lake or the river, both within walking distance, and hiked in the summer and partied any time. We started doing our own gong show, doing all sorts of silly or serious acts, which was most enjoyable. During the summer of 1971, we took a belated honeymoon trip to Hawaii. On the flight over, we noticed another couple about our ages, Roy and Sheila Vandersheer. The following morning, as we were eating breakfast, they walked over to our table, introduced themselves, and said they had noticed us the day before. Sheila was an elementary physical education teacher, and Roy an assistant superintendent for elementary. We became fast friends. We made a dozen flying trips, usually across Lake Michigan, over the next 15 years to visit them, and they would often meet us at other places, usually when the Whalens and Wilcoxes were present. A conflict Betsy and I had regarding religion was not about belief in God or the lack of it, but rather how much money she was giving to her church. She was often not careful about paying her bills on time, and that was starting to affect my credit rating. So I started balancing our checkbooks and paying most of our bills. Since that early time in our marriage, it has been one of my main responsibilities to balance the checkbooks, pay the bills, and do the taxes. Since I keep track of such on my computer, accounting has generally been enjoyable for me to do. We occasionally differed regarding relationships with my children, but I readily agreed that overall, Betsy was very loving and considerate of their welfare. I was and am very appreciative of Betsy's social ability. She welcomed friends to our home, organized gatherings, and became one of the world's best card senders. She was good at getting ready to travel, and we flew and drove all over the country. During Christmas vacation time in 1970 was our first trip to the Florida Keys. Paul and Donna had been going there and encouraged us to join them at the Big Pine Key Fishing Club and Campground. Betsy and I and the kids drove down in my new 71 Ford station wagon and started what was almost an annual Christmas time event for us for about 20 years. The Big Pine site was a great place to catch baby alligators. There were abandoned narrow dredged canals only about a foot wide and perhaps 12 feet deep that were ideal places for the babies, and their eyes would light up with a flashlight beam, so it was easy to sneak up on them and capture them. Carefully, preferably. In February 1970, I restarted my flying lessons, and by September of 1972 had earned my private pilot certificate. I had to pay for those lessons on my own for this first license, but proceeded to get commercial, multi-engine, instrument, instructor, and helicopter ratings and certificates that were paid for up to 90% by the GI Bill. I achieved my highest rating instrument instructor in 1984. After getting my private pilot certificate, I started giving many people rides, first with Betsy and my kids, then I made my first and more than 80 flights to Ironwood. My parents were living in La Grande, Oregon, and Betsy and I flew out there 10 different times, twice with Paul and Donna. We flew to New Orleans or Texas 18 times and to Florida 14 times. My pilot's license was a boon to my life and a most enjoyable activity. Our initial trips to Florida were driving, but in 1974, Betsy, Gary, Judy, Bill, Ricky, and I flew down in a 6-place Cherokee 6 757 UG. Flying was more expensive, but nearly always faster. We landed at Marathon, and Paul and Donna picked us up. In August of 1976, I bought into an airplane partnership with 4 others, buying a Grumman Traveler. It is a 4-place, single-engine, low-winged airplane. Most of my flying, over 3,150 hours, was in this airplane. Jim Carruthers, one of the original owners and one with the most flying experience, made a bad landing and the front end had to be rebuilt. The new front end was more streamlined, so the performance was better. Our insurance paid for most of it, but our partnership broke up. 2 of us, Marvin Prothero and I, became the new owners. Marvin had his own machine tool shop and was having financial difficulties, so we decided to add partners. I recruited Marvin Thompson and Jeff Bonaguru, both employees in the Rockford School District, to join us, and later Bob Augustine became a partner. I headed the group, doing the scheduling, being treasurer, and keeping track of maintenance and licensing. I also, with my instructor's license, was able to recertify their licenses. I, by far, did most of the flying. In December of 1977, Betsy and I flew down to Florida with Katie Adams and her son Keith in my new airplane, and we stayed at a house on Summerland Key that Paul had just bought, but not stayed in. We had a big job of cleaning up the house and yards, but it was a big improvement over tenting. We flew from Rockford to Lakeland, Florida, the first day and stayed that night with Aunt Ida and Uncle Ralph. The second day, we flew on to Summerland Key, where there was a private airport. It was not legal or smart to land there after dark. On later trips, when we arrived after dark, we would usually land at Marathon. In addition to our many trips to Florida or Upper Michigan, we took family trips to Disneyland, a similar amusement park in St. Louis, and several trips out west to visit my parents. My son Bill remembers our trips to Bryce Canyon and Zion National Parks, the Four Corners Monument, and John Stone's Ranch near Granby, Colorado. We visited many of the national parks and canoed and rafted many different rivers. One canoe trip I should not have attempted was the Merced River at Yosemite National Park. I did not check out the route and conditions, and we almost lost our canoe and could have lost our lives. My flying instructor rating permitted me to start giving flying lessons. My first student was Connie Tucker, a fellow principal, on September 28, 1975. My second was Bill Weldon, the husband, later ex, of my secretary at Latham Park and then at Haight. I set up a flight instruction business, and it was very helpful for my federal taxes in that it provided an additional deduction for many years. I gave instruction to dozens of people, but only had 2 who, under my tutelage, got their private pilot certificate. They were Dave Lyons, whose wife, Kathy, taught at Haight, and Bill Weldon, Audra's husband. I started flying officers of the Teachers Union down to Springfield, Illinois, when they often had meetings starting on Friday evenings. I occasionally dined with them, but usually dined alone that evening, often took in a movie, and they provided me with my own hotel room. Their meetings continued the following day, ending usually after a noon luncheon, and then I would fly them back to Rockford. I spent much of my spare time in the Illinois State History Museum in downtown Springfield. During our week-long spring break in 1974, I rented the Cherokee 6, and Betsy and I, Darwin and Ellie, and Bob and Jerry flew to Denver for a skiing vacation. As we were approaching Stapleton Airport in Denver, it started clouding up. I was on an instrument flight plan with air traffic control, and I was handed off to tower control. My approach would have taken me into the clouds, and because I did not yet have my instrument rating, I told the tower controller that I did not have the rating. I should have just proceeded to fly through a little bit of cloud illegally. I had made many instrument landings under the hood with my instructor beside me during many months of training to get my instrument rating, but in this instance I obeyed the rules. The tower controller told me to climb to avoid the clouds and said, "Don't worry, I'll keep you away from the mountains." I could see the mountains without any problem, and I could have flown back about 15 miles to a smaller airport that was uncontrolled. But I flew around while the controller had another small airplane lead me under the clouds to the airport. That took an extra half an hour maybe, and ever since has led me to being teased by those friends and many others within hearing distance. I volunteered to be treasurer for the Rockford Principals Association. It took relatively little time to perform the duties, and offered a stipend for those members who would attend state and national meetings. Few others took advantage of it, so I attended meetings almost every year, and often Betsy would be able to accompany me. I also would often accompany her when she attended teachers' conventions out of town, and she would occasionally accompany me when I attended required biannual flight reviews required for flight instructors. My brother Paul had bought a house on a canal on Summerland Key in 1976, and soon realized he would like a bigger place. Around 1977, he bought an oceanfront lot adjacent to his house, and he and his sons and friends started building the new house. From that time on, for several years, whenever Betsy and I, her brother, and our friends vacationed in the Florida Keys, we helped with the construction. Paul said that we should feel free to come down and stay in his new home anytime we wanted. We did. In the early spring of 1977, Darwin and I were the first ones to arrive at Don Carter Lane's bowling alley for Friday afternoon happy hour. We noticed two young women, apparently high school age, at the bar. Then I recognized one of them, Monica Olson, my daughter Judy's best friend. I walked up to her teasingly to gruffly ask her what she was doing in a bar. Only then did I recognize the other girl, Judy. Both were very embarrassed, but relaxed, after I cheerfully asked how they managed to be there. Both, having been born in 1959, had cut the 9 out of their paper driver's license and turned the number over, making it appear that they were 3 years older than they really were. We have laughed about that ever since. Judy has told me that she has never remembered me ever being angry or unfair with her. I feel exceptionally lucky to have had her for a daughter. In the spring of 1979, I became aware that my son Bill was not doing well in his senior year in high school. I really felt guilty that I had paid so little attention. He had always seemed to do well in school, but now was leaving before graduation. But he did then attend Rockford Public School's adult evening classes and earned his high school diploma. I gave him a 71 AMC Javelin to drive. In August, he joined the Army, and I stored his Javelin for a while. He made the Army his career. I am pleased with the way he used much of his time while in the service, especially advancing his formal education. In March of 1980, I got a call from the University of Illinois saying that my son Gary was in trouble and I needed to pick him up. I and Ricky flew down in a rented Cessna 172 XP. We picked up Gary and all his stuff and were able to get it all into the airplane to fly back to Rockford. Gary lived with his mother and her new husband Larry for about a week, and then about a week with Betsy and me, and then with Rich and Kay Freeman for several months. This was the year I was baptized for the second time, and memorably too, but not for the same reasons. Both Ricky and Gary were intensely religious, and I was as irreligious as I had ever been. I wish now that I had been more tolerant of their zeal. Ricky had found a sacred spot in a creek near his home that he felt would be a perfect place for me to be baptized again, and he and his brother would lead the ceremony. I wanted nothing to do with it, but they were insistent, saying that if I would do it, the Holy Spirit would come into my life, and I would fundamentally change. I finally agreed to do so with the stipulation that if I did not change, they would do what I asked them to do for the next 2 years. I promised that I would not ask them to do anything that was unreasonable. So, we drove to a spot near the creek that evening after dark. I entered the water with them and let them pray over and sprinkle me. Nothing miraculous happened, so we went to our homes. The next morning, we met again to discuss it all, and they told me that I had changed, and I just didn't realize it. I might as well have not gone through the ritual. However, I suggested that Gary join the Army, which he did in August 1980. It seemed to me that it provided some stability that was helpful for him at the time. After Ricky's 3 siblings moved away from Rockford, he and I did many things together. I did more flying, traveling by car, motorcycling, canoeing, and rafting with him than I had with any of the others. We were the first and only ones in our family to take an aluminum canoe down a stretch of the Montreal River that I found out later is rated a number 5 in difficulty. We made it okay, but badly damaged the canoe. On Sunday, May 3rd, 1981, we got word from Betsy from up north that her mother, Malvina, had died, and we made plans to go up the next day. Ricky and I decided to ride motorcycles that afternoon, and I had an accident after running into a too sandy area. I was knocked unconscious and awoke riding on the back of Ricky's bike on the way to the hospital. Later on, I became aware that the only thing I could remember from the accident was the front wheel violently swiveling. I was proud of Ricky's composure and action in getting me medical attention. A couple days later, we attended Malvina's funeral, I with my head bandaged and feeling extra chagrin. In the fall of 1981, Ricky committed a violent act. He was attending a party with other young people and attacked a musician with a knife. He had a hallucination that if he would rid the world of that musician, he would rid the world of strife. He was incarcerated for his actions and adjudged guilty by mentally ill. He was also cited for contempt of court, and after serving several months in the local jail, spent about 4 more months at the Menard Correctional Center in southern Illinois. I was able to fly down to see him several times while he was there. After his release, he lived with his mother, but would often stay overnight with us on Clifford Avenue, and he was able to get employment at a fast food place close by. He often seemed to resume his old cheerful demeanor, but often too seemed lost in a quasi-religious trance. On April 5th, 1983, Ricky ended his life by jumping off a bridge onto the interstate highway. He and Gary had been at my house earlier that evening, and Gary was with him when he died. I know how devastated I was with the news. It was years later that I learned of additional details and how much more traumatic it was for Gary. Gary and I have decided to soon collaborate on a biography of Ricky's life. Now, I will just write that at the time, it left a vast void in the lives of those who knew Ricky well. It also caused me to reflect upon how I should have done things differently and changes I should try to make in my behavior. After Betsy's mother's death, our house in Michigan was generally vacant except for the times we were vacationing there. We had become acquainted with Monica and Norman Bishop, who were working at the Sail Inn, a little bar and dining place just down the road from us. They later purchased the Bear Track cabins just up the road from us and would often use our home for lodging larger groups, or on occasions when their own cabins were full. This made another significant deduction for our income taxes. Around the same time, we met Monica, Betsy, and I met John Hellman. He lived briefly in Don Hill's house across Black River Road from us, and we initially met on the pitch-black road on a winter night as we were walking down to the Sail Inn, possibly for the fish fry. Betsy and I, Bob and Jerry Weiland, and Darwin and Ellie often met at the Powers cabin at Colon, Michigan. Our first visit there was soon after Bill and Carol's wedding in May 1981, and continued for many seasons. Our friends, Roy and Sheila, lived near Muskegon, Michigan, and would occasionally join us. It is a grand place for canoeing and became one of my favorite places to visit. We had little or no contact with John and Judy Stone, who lived in Madison, Wisconsin. My contacts with John suddenly picked up in 1972 when he contacted us and invited us up to Madison for a visit. We accepted and had an enjoyable time. Several years later, he invited us up for a snowmobile race that he organized, but we had relatively few other social contacts with the Stones. In the fall of 1976, we found out that John needed investors for the Compass Club, a group he headed. He talked Betsy into being a sales rep of a sort to promote it. As a member, you could go to the resort for reduced rates and supposedly get the best bookings. John talked us into investing in the club, even though we felt we had no money to invest. John headed the Janif Credit Corporation in Madison and was in cahoots with a Walter O'Connor who headed the Algoma State Bank in Algoma, Wisconsin. They had made a bad investment in constructing a new resort in Steamboat Springs, Colorado, and needed new investors. John said his credit company could easily rewrite my mortgage on our home on Clifford Avenue in Loves Park. It was obvious to me that he was vastly overvaluing our personal property as well as our other real estate, but he said it was routine in the credit business. He was so anxious to promote the deal that he said that Janif would be paying our mortgage for us. Betsy was taken in with the idea of promoting the club, and I was interested in what looked like a great way to make a lot of money. I was naive. After signing the papers and finalizing the deal, perhaps only a month had gone by when I got a notice in the mail that my mortgage was not being paid for. I called John, and he claimed it was an oversight, and he would take care of it right away. He did not. Within the year, the Compass Club, the Algoma Bank, Janif Credit Corporation, and John Stone went belly up, and we ended up owing about $85,000 on the mortgage to the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation. This all ended up with what I consider the second most shameful activity of my life. I am not particularly ashamed for being naive about John Stone's machinations, but rather of my own greed of that involvement. Knowing that I had the huge debt on my house that I could not easily pay, I consulted Lewis Gilbert, a bankruptcy attorney, for advice. He did not advise me to run up my debts any more than I already had, but on my own, I did run up what I owed on credit cards. And then we filed for bankruptcy. I had debts of $116,000 and assets of just over $10,000. Many of my machinations were at least questionable. Afterwards, we were only a little worse off financially than we were when we took up with John Stone and Company. With Bill Powers, on the other hand, my Army friendship has been really enjoyable. We often visited him in Chicago, Detroit, his cabin in Colon, Michigan, and now at their beautiful home in northern Georgia. And he and Carol have often visited us here in Michigan. He is a staunch conservative and an NRA member, so we have lots to argue about, but he too is a skeptic, so we agree about much too. So the military was a mixed experience for me, mostly not all that enjoyable, and meeting John Stone was a questionable experience, but meeting Bill Powers was great. In September of 1981, we made one of our most memorable flights. Betsy and I flew with Darwin and Ellie from Rockford to Chicago in my airplane 5484L to see the Chicago Bears play Tampa Bay at Soldier Field. We flew straight east to Lake Michigan and then down along the lakeshore and Chicago skyline to land at Meigs Field. From there, we were able to easily walk to the game. A minor disadvantage for me being the pilot is that I could not party using alcohol while acting as pilot in command. Our oldest grandchild, Kristen Marie, was born on May 10, 1982 in Hawaii to our son Bill and Sheila Bibble. They never married, and Kristen lived in Idaho with her mother and maternal grandparents, Paul and Sandy Bibble. I know I should not have a favorite grandchild, but since we got to see so much of her over the years, and her mother and maternal grandparents were so hospitable to us, and that Kristen was so loving, I can't help it. In the fall of 1984, I became principal at Jackson School in the Rockford School District, and remained in that position for 5 years. I tried to get a volleyball group organized there, but it never seemed to catch on. 2 friends I made there were Jim Bloom and Jim Misner, whose birthdays were the same as my parents. I regret that I lost contact with them after I retired. One weekday afternoon in June 1988, 2 weeks after the students and teachers were done with their year, I had everything done that I needed to do regarding ending my employment, but it was about 2 hours earlier than my regular quitting time. My secretary seemed to sense my thinking and said something like, "Why not leave now and get a great start on your retirement?" Betsy had left for up north a week or so earlier, and I was anxious to get up there too. I was packed up ready to go that morning, so I left the school and hit the road for Upper Michigan. I was perhaps breaking the speed limit when the thought hit me, "What's your hurry? You've got the rest of your life ahead of you." It was a good start for a great retirement. I used my little Dodge Omni, often pulling a trailer to haul stuff up north, and later purchased Paul's GMC diesel van to do so. My most common trip was between Rockford and Black River Harbor. I often would spend most of the month up north, but go back to Rockford to pay bills, do home maintenance, and say hello to Betsy. As I write this, I have been retired for almost 29 years, almost as long as I was employed as an educator. At Black River Harbor, I spent a great deal of time adding a garage, a great room, a breezeway, and a rainwater storage system to our home. I have since spent too much time regretting that I did not get professional help designing the garage and breezeway. My new garage should have been perhaps twice as big as I built it because I need room for more stuff than 2 cars. I should have built a second story for carry-in storage. I did enjoy doing the work, however. Building things makes it easy to see what you have accomplished. Much of my time up north was spent making new trails, often deer paths, and clearing old ones, usually old logging roads for cross-country skiing and hiking. Much of the land was part of the Ottawa National Forest, which borders the west boundary of our property, and the rest private property. I would get permission from the owners of the private property to trespass, but never sought it from the U.S. Forest Service. I was quite sure I would not get permission to build bridges or use ATVs on their land. After I started using firewood, I could, for a $20 annual fee, gather downed trees to make it. For several years prior to my retirement, I used Betsy's brother Roy's big red 3-wheeler ATV and later bought it from him when he bought a newer 3-wheeler for himself. I used it to pull cedar logs made from fallen trees to make the main beams for bridges to cross small ravines, streams, or just a wide wet spot. But a real need was to keep the weeds down to keep an open path. I bought a new Yamaha Big Bear ATV in April of 1996 and had a local welder build a rig that mounted on top of it. I had copied the design from my dad's big D6 Caterpillar trailer, and the rig may have saved me from serious injury or even death on 4 different occasions over the years. 3 when the ATV tipped over and the rig prevented it from rolling, and once when a large branch fell, hitting the rig instead of me. The electric winch's cable could be rigged by a set of pulleys to lift from either the front or back. I could tow a long log by chaining one end to the tow bar and lifting that end slightly to keep it from catching obstacles. I also modified motorized lawnmowers to tow and used the rig to lift them for transport. For about 25 years, I kept the trails in pretty good shape. I had about 17 miles of trails. I used my ATVs to haul in firewood from the woods. I cut up fallen trees at the spot where they were, pulled my log splitter to the side, and hauled the split firewood to the site where I wanted it stacked. For years, the bulk of the firewood was thrown into the basement, and there I would stack it, mainly to compact the space it took up, and to make room for more to be thrown in. In helping my brother Paul move houses in the early 1960s, I had learned how to build cribs to hold up the houses and use ropes and pulleys to move heavy loads. It helped me be a small-time lumberjack. Perhaps my major accomplishment with my rope and pulley activity was erecting my own 30-foot-high cedar flagpole. When I built the addition to the house in 1988 to 89, I put a new wood stove in the great room and an older used wood stove in the basement. We had electric heaters to keep things warm when we were absent or when I was too busy with other things to tend the fires. I naively thought I could easily tend fires for most of my retirement, but several years now have gone by when I have not been able to make firewood or tend the fires comfortably, if at all. I did have a LP gas-fueled furnace installed in 2014, and I have ceased using the basement wood stove, but generally I have enjoyed having the wood stove in our great room. After Betsy retired in 1993 and then spent 5 more years being very active as president of the Rockford Entertainment League, she moved up to Black River Harbor for good. At that time, we were able to sell our Clifford Avenue house for a profit and before a real estate crash. Another example of having good luck in my life. She immediately became much more active in this community, especially in church activities, the Kiwanis Club, theater groups, and social groups like the Red Hats. She became acquainted with Arlene Schneller, a local realtor who organized a newcomers club that we joined. Betsy's contacts expanded my circle of friends exponentially. One couple in the Newcomers Club was Dave and Karen Evans, with whom we have since taken many driving trips into Minnesota, Wisconsin, here in Michigan, and into Canada. They introduced us to science workshops and musical events in Ashland, Wisconsin, which we have since regularly attended and enjoyed. They have hosted annual winter solstice parties for over 9 years. I was able to enjoy my dogs more. My parents told me that as a little child I seemed to enjoy pets, especially dogs. In 1992, my son Bill asked me to take care of his Sophie, a 2-year-old Cocker Spaniel. I started taking her with me on trips to the Upper Peninsula, but Betsy missed having her around, so she bought a new pup, Ebony, another Cocker. However, if I took Sophie alone up north, the dogs seemed to miss each other. So I started regularly traveling with both of them. I especially enjoyed my time in Illinois walking in the park that was close by, and they seemed to enjoy traveling. They had great freedom to run the yard and trails up north. Also, it always seemed to be a joyous time when we got back together after being separated. We took them with us on long driving trips out west to Florida and even Alaska. I began a routine of walking with them almost every day, and usually twice a day. We all enjoyed the walks, and we need that exercise. Sophie died in late 2003, and the next summer we were given 5-year-old Halo by Paul's wife Sandy. Halo was a white Pekingese who lived with us for the next 11 years. Ebony died in the fall of 2004, so Halo was our lone pet for 7 years until my son Gary asked us to watch his dog Daisy for a couple of weeks. Daisy is a graying-black Schipperke and has been with us for nearly 5 years now. The biggest dog we have had was Molly, a German-bearded wire-haired pointer. Our friend John Hellman had a tenant, Daryl Finn, who owned Molly. In January of 2010, John noticed that there were no tracks in the snow, leading from his tenant house to the mailbox. He investigated and found Finn dead, and Molly guarding the body. I told John that I would like another dog, and he gave Molly to me. Finn had overfed Molly with people food, and left no records of Molly's birth, and apparently never had her registered or cared for with any of the local veterinarians. 2 local veterinarians who got to know Molly estimated her age to be about 5 at the time, as did dog trainer and groomer Peggy Crone. Molly was very friendly and active, especially enjoying fetching sticks and cavorting in the water. She lived with us until her death in December of 2014. In July of 2016, I was lucky again to go to the local dog shelter in Ironwood shortly after it opened for the same day as Max arrived and was put up for adoption. Max was about 1.5 years old, and I was told that he was too difficult to handle for the older couple who gave him up for adoption. I felt and feel that I needed to have a challenge to be more active. He has definitely been a challenge, but also seems to be about the most affectionate pooch we have ever had. Betsy and I fit the stereotype of doting old people who pamper their dogs, but we both greatly enjoy their companionship, and I believe that they inspire me to get the exercise I need to stay healthy. I was able to spend some quality time with my parents. It had been 35 years from the time I was first married to Marcy to the time I retired that I was able to spend more than an occasional few days visiting them. I was able to travel with them to visit relatives in Wenatchee, Washington, the place my dad was born in 1909. I was able to drive him for medical appointments in Boise, Idaho from his home in La Grande, Oregon. He and I made a trip together to see my brother Richard and his wife Jan in Pullman, Washington, and then over to see the Dry Falls, where ancient Lake Missoula catastrophically occasionally emptied. I was able to help him with some home maintenance and yard work. It was quality time that I really enjoyed. My freedom to travel permitted me to spend time with my youngest brother Stephen. He and Dad showed me some of the sights in La Grande, and we hiked in the mountains east of there. Betsy and I took him with us when we visited her brother Dewey at Westport, Washington. There we went on a fishing boat cruise out on the Pacific Ocean. I also traveled with my friend Darwin down to Florida, while our wives were working in Illinois to pay the bills. On the way back north, we visited my grandchildren in Virginia, and we visited Virginia Beach where Darwin had been stationed while in the Navy. One memorable solo trip I made to Oregon in September of 1993 was extended for 2 weeks when I hit a deer on Interstate 84 northwest of La Grande. With my dad, I was driving my diesel van up in a mountainous area at night when the deer jumped over the guardrail directly in front of me, disabling the van and ending the life of the deer. I had teased Betsy for years because she seemed to keep hitting deer and ruining cars, but now I joined her in doing so. A few years later, Betsy and I were returning from a western trip, traveling in eastern Nebraska when I hit another deer at night. That time we had to rent a car to get Betsy back home to Illinois, and I had to make the long round trip back to Nebraska to retrieve her car. Then, a year or so later, I hit a deer just down the road from our house on an icy winter day. The deer ran in front of my truck, slipped and fell, and it was too icy for me to avoid hitting it. The truck was not hurt, not so the deer. And the last one I hit was about 3 years ago when Dave and Karen Evans and Betsy and I were traveling in southern Wisconsin on a sunny day on a busy highway. The deer ran across, getting missed by all the cars except Betsy's Honda, which I was driving. Stupid deer. I was able to travel alone or sometimes with friends to Florida. I traveled twice to the Florida Keys with my friend Don Hill. Don was helpful for me when I started remodeling our Black River Harbor home. He brought his friend Bob Blomberg to help. Bob was an expert with cement work and guided us in laying the garage and breezeway floors. He also laid the blocks for the chimneys in my great room and the garage. They got paid for their efforts with beer that I bought. It was well worth it to me. I really appreciated my friendship with Monica Bishop. She and her husband Norman would occasionally invite me up to their home for a meal. The first of one of those occasions was a dark winter evening, and after the meal I was walking home, having to feel my way on the paved roadway. I was startled by a deer snorting. To my uninitiated ears, it sounded more like what I imagined was a wolf or a bear. Monica and I would often take walks together out on the trail or down on the beach. Also, we would occasionally snowshoe or cross-country ski together. One spring morning in 1998, we were walking in the woods behind our homes. She told me that she and Norman were going to divorce. I was very upset because I enjoyed the company of both of them. Monica was upset because she did not want to quit living at Black River Harbor. That spring, Betsy resigned as president of the Rockford Entertainment League, a position she held for 10 years, and moved here to Michigan from Illinois. We decided to remodel our home, putting in an apartment upstairs for Monica. The remodeling we did in 1998 involved me tearing out the south and west walls of our little downstairs bathroom, and Betsy planning with our neighbor Bob Landis the new design. Betsy went with Bob across the road to his house and saw the beautiful work he had done building their bathroom. Then Bob, acting as our general contractor, did much of the plumbing and the electrical work and all of the tile work, and did our new bathroom and a new bathroom upstairs. Monica lived with us for 8 years. On February 26, 1998, I was in Rockford at home with Betsy and sitting at my computer doing my thing. I did constructive things like accounting, paying bills, and correspondence, but probably spent more time playing chess or freestyle games. I was lucky that I was there rather than up north out in the woods, or traveling someplace far away from home, or flying in my airplane. I felt unusual discomfort in my shoulders, and mentioned it to Betsy. Had she not been at home, I may have ignored the discomfort for too long. She said I should go to the doctor to be checked out, and I agreed, and said I would drive my van less than a block to the medical clinic. Betsy wanted to drive me, but I insisted I could drive. She was not surprised when she got a call from the clinic shortly after I left, saying that they were transporting me to the hospital for a suspected heart attack. After arriving, I had various tests and then promptly went into surgery where they put a stent in an artery. I was able to walk around that very day, but spent several days in the hospital. I have had regular checkups since, and am told that my heart is in pretty good shape. However, since then I have had much trouble sleeping, possibly because of the medications I must take, and I lost my flying medical license. Another serious problem was taken care of in August of 2012 when I had an intestinal resection taking out a cancerous spot. Several rechecks have concluded that it is no longer a problem. I am convinced, in spite of a few problems, that I am lucky to have had good genes, good medical care, and have been able to pay for it. Conclusion. Writing in October 2016, after a good night's sleep, I started thinking about how to finish this autobiography. I have often said in conversations or in writing, usually email, that I consider myself a lucky man. I was born in the United States to loving parents who were both well-educated and who assisted me in getting a good education. It was luck that I was born here in the United States, which has only about 4% of the world's population, and that both of my parents were well-educated. I married Marcy after my sophomore year in college, and she put me through my junior and senior years. We then had our 4 children, and they were able to live in a beautiful home in a nice neighborhood with good schools. I had many good friends and a good job. I obviously must have used some of my own effort to achieve such, but luck was definitely a factor. For example, I prepared to be an educator, and during my early career there was a teacher shortage, so I never had any trouble getting a good job right away. As a successful young man, I made some terrible decisions. I left the church mainly because I no longer believed in God and often did not enjoy its activities. But I did not consider how my not attending church would affect my children. Perhaps I should have switched to the Unitarian Church, where several of my good friends attended, and non-believers were generally accepted. And I suspect that Marcy would have joined too. After I quit going to church, Marcy and the kids joined a congregational church close to our home. Also, about the same time, I let my carnal desires affect my behavior. But since then, I think I have changed in some fundamental ways, and the following is how. I bought Doris Kearns Goodwin's book, Lincoln, Team of Rivals, and later bought it for my Kindle. I have reread it numerous times, and have often talked and written about it. Lincoln's life, compared to mine, was not lucky. He was born into poverty, his 2 siblings and his mother died at young ages. All of them, and his father, were illiterate, and he had less than a year of formal schooling. He was loved by his mother and stepmother, but did not get along with his father, who often seemed inconsiderate. But his father was apt to telling stories and jokes. Lincoln perhaps inherited that trait and also a strong physique from his father. He shared with the majority of citizens a bias against blacks, but his actions as president to enfranchise them shows that he could change. Goodwin's book is well researched and in agreement with most other biographies of Lincoln that I have read. But she does tell of Lincoln's mistakes and failings, and I think that has led to my better understanding of the man. And I think that understanding has led me to try to be a better person. One of his greatest traits was to try to get along well with everyone, even if they had treated him badly. He initially included in his cabinet his 3 main rivals for the presidency, Seward, Chase, and Bates, and later named Edwin Stanton, Secretary of War, even after Stanton, a Democrat, not a member of Lincoln's Republican Party, had unjustly criticized him for his early conduct of the Civil War, and who years before had uncivilly treated him regarding legal work. Lincoln's earlier political life had instances where fellows treated him unfairly or with contempt, but Lincoln had the ability to forgive and forget, and nearly all of them later became strong supporters and friends. Lincoln's engagement and marriage with Mary Todd was tumultuous and often a very unhappy time for him, but he seemed to treat her with great respect and understanding, especially considering their terrible losses of 2 young sons. If I compare my life with Lincoln's, I have had 2 wives that certainly were easier to get along with than Mary Todd probably was. I lost my youngest son when he was using illegal drugs. Since that time, I have often been alienated from my sons Bill and Gary over what really should have been only minor disputes, but often it was about religion. Had I been imbued with the spirit of Abraham Lincoln when I was married to Marcia, I suspect I would still be happily married now after 63 years. I should have treated Betsy as I treated the other pretty young teachers I met, but I cannot undo what I have done. I actually know very little about Jesus. None of his disciples were literate, nor was Jesus himself. His biographer, Saul of Tarsus, never met Jesus. So, the earliest stories about Jesus were second-hand, and much seems embellished or unbelievable to me. If the story of the faith of a Canaanite woman, Matthew 15:21-26, is true, Jesus compared her to a dog before he granted her wish. That implies to me that he was bigoted. On the other hand, we know a great deal about Lincoln because thousands of people met him, and many of them wrote down their thoughts of him, and he became known to many at a time when newspapers were most popular and politics was the most popular topic, and people flocked to hear politicians speak. I do not apologize for my lack of faith in God. Emulating Lincoln seems right for me now. I would like to end this in a positive way, but I am writing this after Donald Trump has been president for only 6 weeks. Our country has had to endure other presidents who did not do well, and I have lived while 13 other individuals have served as president. The only one I think I did not evaluate while he was in office was Roosevelt, but I was only 11 when he died. Trump is the only one I have seriously worried about. There is little I can do except speak up when I think he is mistaken and try to preserve an optimistic outlook for life on Earth. See Politics, an addendum for more on my political reflections. Betsy and I are preparing for the twilight of our lives together. We are making our third major remodeling of our home by having a lift installed in the breezeway between our garage and great room. It will permit us to not navigate any stairs and will even handle wheelchairs if it comes to that. I hope to be able to live here to the end, but Betsy has purchased long-term life insurance coverage that will make it possible for her to be comfortably ensconced in a nursing home. We plan on a big reunion with friends and family on August 20th, 2017 in Clarksville, Tennessee. The big event will be a total eclipse of the sun, something that will attract worldwide attention and huge crowds. My son, Bill, and his wife, Suzanne, have a beautiful home there, and I have rented 3 motel rooms. I have been most fortunate to have had wonderful people for family and friends, 2 loving wives, to have lived during a time of relative peace and prosperity, and to have had good health. I have had lots of luck. Politics, an addendum. I was born less than 3 months after Franklin Delano Roosevelt became President of the United States. So for the first 12 years of my life, he was my president. I don't remember much about him at all, except that I remember him talking on the radio, and I did not have negative thoughts about him. I do remember my mother being upset when we became involved in World War II, and I think I remember our declaration of war. But I probably am just remembering Roosevelt's speeches that were recorded and later often broadcast on television. I do remember his successor, Harry Truman, who received a lot of criticism, especially about his relationship with General Douglas MacArthur. My first political act that I recall was to write to Truman and commend him for his actions. I received a reply, probably a form letter, from the Democratic National Committee chairman, and still have the commemorative envelope with Truman's picture on it. My Democratic bias didn't last long, however, because in my sophomore year in college, as part of a psychology or sociology class, I organized and became president of the Young Republicans Club. The only memory I have of that endeavor was that there were several others who belonged to the club who seemed to be rather odd. In retrospect, I must have been as odd as any of them. Anyway, I was going to a liberal arts college, and most of my professors and fellow students seemed to be rather liberal and were generally opposed to the military and to President Eisenhower. But I thought Eisenhower was doing a good job. He was the first president I was able to vote for, and I still admire him for his prescience on the Cold War, the military-industrial complex, and our interstate highway system. As most of us mature, we become wiser and less naive. Perhaps as evidence of that, in my case, was my support of Truman regarding General MacArthur. It was many years later that I read how poorly MacArthur did militarily as commander of U.S. forces in the Philippines. He made no preparations for the expected Japanese attack that came the day after the attack on Pearl Harbor, and most of his planes were destroyed on the ground. When the Japanese landed near Manila 2 weeks later, MacArthur's retreat was skillfully conducted, but he neglected his supply lines, and soon his troops were short of food, medicine, ammunition, and other supplies. Soon they had to surrender, and MacArthur ignominiously retreated with a few of his staff and his family to Australia. Yet he was lauded as a great hero by the conservatives in particular, and seemingly by the majority. I knew MacArthur was a Republican, but it was many years later that I learned that he mainly had the support of the ultra-conservatives. When North Korea invaded South Korea in June of 1950, MacArthur was made commander of the United Nations troops there, mostly Americans. He led a brilliant surprise amphibious landing behind enemy lines and drove the North Koreans out of South Korea. But MacArthur disregarded intelligence reports and diplomatic warnings about Chinese intervention if he invaded deep into North Korea. And when the Chinese did intervene, they caused what Time magazine said was the worst defeat the United States had ever suffered. The conservatives supported MacArthur's efforts to widen the Korean War by suggesting attacking communist China, even using atomic weapons, and applauded him whenever he publicly disagreed with his commander-in-chief, President Truman. Charles Long, 1 year older than I, also attended Durand High School. He became a MIA. He and over 50,000 other American troops died in that war. For what? In retrospect, had MacArthur stayed out of northern North Korea, we may have had only a small fraction of the number of casualties that we actually had. It seemed that in those days everything was anti-communist, and the domino theory prevailed. That was the theory that assumed if you let one government become communist, its neighbors would then become communist. So, we had to defend South Korea so that Japan, Taiwan, the Philippines, Indonesia, Vietnam, and Australia would not fall to the communists. It was Eisenhower's Secretary of State, John Foster Dulles, and his brother Allen Dulles, head of the CIA, who formulated the domino theory. Before I read deeply on such subjects, I guess I generally supported them. When the Vietnam War was in full blast and when Watergate occurred, I believe it was at that time I became a liberal. There seemed to be little influence from my peers and the media to be against the war, but it just seemed wrong to me. The demonstrations against the war, especially in Washington, D.C., and also at the Democratic National Convention when Hubert Humphrey was nominated, were influential. Later, when Bush declared war in Iraq, it seemed to be a particularly erroneous thing to do. And as corporate America has seemed to take over, and as more and more politicians in both parties seemingly become owned by corporate interests, I align myself with liberals. My son Gary and I often argued about politics, but seemed to agree regarding the problems associated with the military-industrial complex and global warming. A main area of disagreement seems to be the role of government. I think that the Democratic-Republican form of government seems to be the best so far devised, but he favors, he says possibly just to play the role of an opposing view, an enlightened aristocracy. We are both aware of the huge problems associated with poor government and economic disparity, but I believe I am more optimistic about the possibility of solutions being found. But perhaps I am not being realistic. I think the essence of being a good human being is to try to be a good citizen of the world. It is okay to be proud of your heritage, baseball team, state, family, religion, or whatever, as long as that pride does not hurt others. I believe that no matter what size or variety of culture we live in, we need to have law and order and to try to stop lawless individuals from harming others. After World War II, the United Nations promoted a Universal Declaration of Human Rights, patterned on our Declaration of Independence, part of which reads, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." Most people of the world probably at least give lip service to the UN Declaration, as do most citizens of the United States agree with ours. But ours says all men are created equal. But how about women? Ours tries to lay out how we make and enforce laws, but the UN's lacks any enforcement process. Our courts to this day labor to define what our founding fathers meant. Good citizens of the world still have a lot of work to do. Some of my acquaintances seem to have little interest in my opinions on politics, religion, economics, etc. But if I sense the disinterest, I try to avoid continuing the discussion, I think. And I know that I often have little interest in many topics that others seem apt. As a man thinketh, so is he, they say. So, I try to keep my mind open to new ideas, but maybe I'm so stuck in my ways that I am really just fooling myself. The end.